You have looked through the whole screen, you have looked through the whole page, all right? So this should be the continent names that you have filled up, okay? Now, Oceania, this is a bit controversial because there are people who, Oceania includes Australia, New Zealand, and some of the islands over here. It's a bit controversial because some people think that it is Australasia, so there's different variations, okay? So it doesn't really matter if you're Oceania or Australasia. All right. Now, I'm going to zoom in further to talk about splitting all this into human regions. I need to look at page 2. Okay. Now, human regions are basically, why do we call it human regions? It's human regions because it is defined by humans. There's no clear border and it's defined due to human reasons. All right. A lot of these continents, there is some physical basis, like because it is, split along the continent or something. Okay. So there's some reason for grouping. But but there's also controversy about this. But anyway, human region is purely based on human reasons, not physical reasons. So it's based on history, culture, and things like that. Okay, so we are grouping. So when we know what are the regions, we can group countries and the data when we describe distribution. All right, so let's go into it. Let's start with North America. Now in your handout, you will see that I have already labeled AM123, so it's easier for you to label E1, E2, E3. Okay, I will also be telling you why we split it that way, and that can help you interpret global distribution for human geography easily. Okay, so let's zoom into North America first. The Americas first. You have the continent North America and South America, and they usually split out in the middle, Central America. All right. Now, again, I said before, there's no need to split hair over the exact border. The rough region is good enough. Okay, now North America is usually seen to be more developed. South America is seen as an emerging economy. Emerging economy means it's an LDC, but it is developing its economy. It has been developing its economy since the 1960s. Okay, and Central America is a mixture. Some parts are emerging, some parts are still LDC. Okay, then let's zoom into another continent, Europe. Okay, Europe is a bit more complicated. All right, Europe generally we split them into Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Okay, now again, you need to split hair over exactly where's the border. Rough region is good enough. Now, Eastern Europe is generally considered it's not LDC, but less developed than Western Europe. Okay, why is that the case? Because historically speaking, Eastern Europe were communist countries in the past. Okay, especially this big one over here is Ukraine. It was actually part of the Soviet Union. So because the economy wasn't very well developed during the 1960s to 1990s as compared to Western Europe, in terms of development, the Eastern Europe is slightly behind than Western Europe. But conventionally speaking, we still consider the whole of Europe as a continent full of DCs. They're all DCs actually. Okay. Now, in Western Europe, we can split them even further. Okay. There's some people call it Northern Europe, but the correct term is Scandinavia. So basically it includes Norway, Finland, Denmark, and Sweden. I think I mixed up Sweden and Finland, but basically these 4 countries. And also Iceland. Sorry for the error, it includes Iceland as well. Okay, why do we call it Scandinavia? Because their culture, these few countries, their culture is similar. And these few countries, among them is similar, but compared to the rest of Europe, the culture is very different. The history is very different. Okay, so that's why I call it Scandinavia. Now, among the whole world, not just Europe, among the whole world, in terms of level of development, Scandinavian countries is considered to be one of the most developed in the world. Okay, so that's Europe for you. I will move on to, a more interesting one would be Africa. Africa, they have multiple regions that we split further. Okay, now these countries right at the northern edge, we call them North Africa because in terms of culture, it is different from the rest of Africa. These countries in the north are actually mostly Arabs, whereas those in the south are from other ethnic groups. So culturally speaking, Northern Africa is different. The history is also different from the rest of the African continent. And North Africa tends to be a bit more developed than the rest of Africa. Okay, so you often see data, especially for food drop, right? North Africa is usually more positive than the rest of Africa. Okay, so this is one anomaly to look out for when you do distribution questions. Right? Now the rest of Africa, we call them Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub means below. All right. Why do we call it below Sahara, sub-Saharan? Because if you can see this whole brown patch over here, this is the Saharan desert. Okay, so this whole region is below or the south of the Saharan desert. That's why we call it sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, there's also within sub-Saharan Africa, we can split it further to Southern Africa, the few countries at the south, okay, especially South Africa, Central Africa, West Africa, and East Africa. Okay, sub-Saharan, especially Central Africa, is usually the poorest and least developed regions in the world. Mostly because there's a lot of political instability over there. Okay, so in most data for development and food, you will see that North is better off than Central and South. Okay, but the ones with the most food consumption issue is always the East and East Africa because of famine in the past and also because of wars. Now East Africa, you can divide them a bit further, especially this part over here. You see it looks like a horn sticking out, right? It's called the Horn of Africa. Now, why do we pick out Horn of Africa? Because when it comes to development and food consumption data, Horn of Africa is usually the worst. Okay, they are one of the poorest regions and one of the lowest food consumption in the data. All right. Now, we're done in Africa. Let's move on to Asia. Asia is a lot more diverse and a lot more region, but easy to make sense. Okay. Now, this part is Middle East. All right. Why is it called Middle East? Because it's mostly countries that are Arab and Persian, and they are mostly in the Muslim Islamic countries. Okay, so in terms of culture, they are quite different from the rest of Asia. All right, this is Central Asia. This was actually a part of Soviet Union. In terms of culture, they are quite different from Middle East, quite different from the rest. Okay, their culture is a bit more like Turkish, and in the past they were nomadic, so that's why they are grouped separately from the rest. All right, and then if this is Central, then of course north to it will be North Asia. This is the whole expanse of Russia. Russia is a bit more problematic because some parts they think they are more European, some parts they are more Asian because they are so big, but that's a discussion for another day. Okay, now the more important regions is, okay, so the more important region, so we have talked about the Asia or Europe part, but they say again, because it's human defined, okay, so some people want to separate Russia, they call them part of Asia, but to Russians, they say that they're part of Europe. Okay, but that's not our point of discussion here, it's just for your knowledge. So the other parts, actually, you can just throw in the compass rose and you can infer already. Okay, if this is North and this is Central, then this side will definitely be East. Okay, East Asia will be China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan. Okay, now these countries, these areas are usually more developed. They are mostly LDCs actually, except for Japan. They're actually still considered LDCs, but they are significantly richer than the rest of Asia, because since the 1960s, they are the ones where they grow most economically, especially for China. Okay, so some data, right, actually put East Asia out of the Asian average because China has a lot of people, 1 billion. They will skew the average to be very high if the other places are very low. Okay, so they try to take out this from the average to make sure that it doesn't skew the data too much. So if this is North, if this is East, then over here would be South. Okay, so South Asia includes India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Pakistan. Okay, so these few countries, they are slightly less developed than the rest of Asia. Okay, and sometimes again they are taken out of the data, especially India, from the average, because there are so many people in India, they can skew the average. All right, so if this is East and this is South, in between them will be Southeast Asia, which is where we are at. Okay, Southeast Asia, so the whole Asia in the 1960s was very poor and very underdeveloped, like quite a few African countries these days. All right, but over the years, this whole region has developed economically. And they consider a lot of the countries here to be emerging economies. That means LDCs, but growing economically very quickly over the years. Okay, so you tend to see that the data for Southeast Asia, this is where all the meat consumption will increase very high in East Asia and Southeast Asia over the years. Okay, so these are the key regions, human regions. Please mark them out. Okay, so that you can use this to group your data and also to make sense of it. All right. The usual anomalies to take note of, especially for food, is always China, India, and Southeast Asia. Okay.